It was July 6th when we arrived at the secluded beach cabin. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand, and the air was filled with the soothing sound of waves crashing against the shore. The cabin itself was charming, with weathered wooden walls and large windows facing the ocean. But as we stepped inside, there was something about the place that made us all feel a little uneasy, like it was holding a secret. That first evening, we explored the cabin, noting its quaint decorations and cozy atmosphere. However, one thing stood out: a small door in the hallway that was locked. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in the otherwise open and airy cabin. Curiosity sparked among us, but we decided to leave it alone, at least for now. We unpacked our bags and settled in, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over us. As night fell, we gathered in the living room, sharing stories and laughter. But as the hours passed, a strange tension filled the air. It was subtle at first, a nagging feeling that something was watching us. I couldn't shake the sensation that the cabin was more than it seemed. The sound of the ocean, once comforting, now felt like it was trying to drown out something else, something lurking within the walls. Later that night, as we all tried to sleep, the silence was shattered by a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was a creaking noise, like old wood bending under pressure. I lay still, heart pounding, as the sound grew louder. It was coming from the hallway, right outside the locked door. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was it just the house settling, or was something or someone trying to get out? The next morning, we all gathered in the kitchen, exchanging uneasy glances. None of us wanted to admit it, but we had all heard the same sound during the night. It wasn't just our imaginations playing tricks on us. The locked door had become the focal point of our fear, and we knew we couldn't ignore it any longer. We decided that after breakfast, we would try to find a way to open it and discover what secrets the cabin was hiding. After breakfast, we stood in front of the locked door, our initial excitement now replaced by a sense of dread. The hallway felt colder, as if the very air around us was warning us to stop. But we were too far gone to turn back. My friend Mark, always the boldest of the group, suggested we search the cabin for a key or anything that might help us open the door. We agreed, splitting up to cover more ground. As we rummaged through drawers and cabinets, the atmosphere inside the cabin grew heavier. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of the wind outside made us jump. I found myself in a small study at the back of the cabin, where a dusty bookshelf lined the walls. On the top shelf, hidden behind a stack of old books, I discovered an old, rusty key. It was strange, almost as if it had been deliberately placed there to be found. I grabbed it and hurried back to the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. With trembling hands, I handed the key to Mark. He hesitated for a moment, then slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into what appeared to be a basement. A musty smell wafted up, mixing with the salty sea air. We exchanged nervous glances, but knew we had to see this through. One by one, we descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing us whole. The basement was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets and boxes stacked high against the walls. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. The sight of it sent chills down my spine. What could be inside? Mark approached it cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. We all held our breath as he lifted the lid. Inside the chest were old photographs, yellowed with age, and a tattered leather-bound journal. The photographs depicted the cabin as it once was, decades ago, with a family posing happily on the beach. But there was something off about the pictures. In the background of each one, there was a shadowy figure, just out of focus, lurking near the cabin. The more we looked, the clearer it became. This figure was in every single photograph. Mark opened the journal, and as he read aloud, we learned the truth about the cabin. It had once belonged to a family, but tragedy had struck. Their young daughter had gone missing, and despite searching everywhere, she was never found. The journal ended abruptly, with the father writing about a figure he had started seeing around the cabin, a figure that seemed to be connected to his daughter's disappearance. As we stood there, absorbing the horrifying story, a cold draft swept through the basement, and the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. The door slamming shut jolted us all into a state of panic. The small basement seemed to close in around us, the air thick with fear. Mark rushed to the stairs, trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. The only light came from a small, dusty window near the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the room. The basement, once just a hidden part of the cabin, now felt like a tomb. As we stood there in silence, trying to make sense of what was happening, the temperature in the basement dropped suddenly. We could see our breath in the cold, damp air. Then, without warning, the old chest we had just opened slammed shut on its own, making us all jump. The sense of being watched, which had plagued us since our arrival, intensified. It was as if the very walls of the cabin were closing in on us, trying to suffocate the truth we had uncovered. We huddled together, our nerves frayed, trying to decide our next move. The photographs and journal had revealed something sinister, something that didn't want to be disturbed. Mark, usually the most rational among us, began to lose his composure. His hands shook as he held the journal, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "We need to leave. Now," he said, but the terror in his eyes told me he didn't believe it was that simple. The door upstairs was sealed tight, and we were at the mercy of whatever haunted this place. Then, a soft sobbing filled the room. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing off the walls. It was the cry of a young girl, desperate and full of sorrow. The sound cut through us like a knife, freezing us in place. We all looked around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the basement was empty, at least to our eyes. The sobbing continued, each wail more heartbreaking than the last, filling us with an overwhelming sense of despair. It was at that moment that we noticed something else. The shadows in the room began to move, slowly at first, then more rapidly, as if they had a life of their own. They twisted and contorted, forming shapes that were vaguely human. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what was happening. The figure from the photographs, the one that had been lurking in the background, was manifesting before our eyes. But it wasn't just one figure. There were many, their forms shifting and writhing in the dim light. As the figures grew more defined, the sobbing turned into a low, mournful wail, a sound that chilled us to the bone. The air became so cold it was hard to breathe, and the shadows crept closer, surrounding us. We were caught in the grip of something beyond our understanding, something that had waited years for someone to uncover its secret. And now that we had, it wasn't going to let us go easily. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive as they closed in around us. My breath came in shallow gasps, the cold seeping into my bones. The figures, now more defined, took on the forms of the family from the photographs: the father, the mother, and the little girl. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow, yet the sorrow and anguish they emanated were palpable. It was as if their pain had been trapped here for decades, festering and growing stronger, waiting for someone to bear witness. Mark, still clutching the journal, seemed to be in a trance. I reached out to shake him, trying to snap him out of it, but his body was rigid, unresponsive. The others were just as frozen, their faces pale with fear. The low wail that filled the room intensified, vibrating through the walls, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. It was a cry of anguish, but also of longing, as if the spirits were searching for something they had lost long ago. In that moment, I understood. The family wasn't trying to harm us. They were seeking closure. The daughter's disappearance, the father's desperate search, the unresolved grief, they were all tied to this place, to the secrets hidden within the cabin. And somehow, we had become a part of their story. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. We had to help them find peace, or we might never leave this place alive. The journal in Mark's hands seemed to pulse with energy, as if it held the key to ending this nightmare. I snatched it from him, flipping through the pages, looking for anything that could help us. Near the end, I found a passage the father had written in desperation. "She's still here. I can feel her presence, but she won't rest. The only way to free her is to acknowledge the truth, to accept what happened. Only then will she find peace." I read the passage aloud, my voice trembling. As the words left my lips, the shadows paused, their forms flickering like a candle in the wind. The wail softened, turning into a soft, almost peaceful hum. The figures of the family turned towards us, their hollow eyes seeming to see us for the first time. The little girl, the source of the sobbing, stepped forward, her shadowy form more solid now, as if she were crossing over from one world to the next. A sense of calm washed over the room as the little girl's figure reached out to us. I could feel her sadness, but also her gratitude. She was finally being acknowledged, her presence no longer a forgotten memory hidden away in the dark. The air in the room lightened, the oppressive cold lifting as the shadows began to dissolve into the air. The little girl smiled, a faint, sad smile, as her form slowly faded into nothingness, taking with her the lingering pain that had haunted this place for so long. The moment the little girl's figure faded completely, the oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on us since we arrived lifted. The basement, once cold and dark, seemed almost warm now, the air light and breathable. We stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. The tension that had gripped us all was gone, replaced by a profound sense of calm. It was as if the cabin itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for decades. We climbed the stairs back to the main floor, our steps lighter, the creaks of the old wood no longer threatening. The door at the top of the stairs, which had been so firmly shut, now swung open effortlessly. Sunlight streamed into the hallway, casting a warm, golden glow that chased away the last remnants of our fear. It felt like we had crossed a threshold, from darkness into light, from fear into understanding. As we gathered in the living room, the journal still in hand, we talked quietly about what had just occurred. It was clear to all of us that the cabin had been more than just a building. It had been a vessel for unresolved pain and sorrow. But now, with the truth acknowledged, the spirits that had once haunted it were free. The cabin, once filled with echoes of the past, now felt like a place of peace. Before we left, we decided to perform a simple ritual, a way to honor the family whose lives had been intertwined with this place. We gathered a few wildflowers from the beach and placed them on the small, worn table in the living room. Each of us said a few words, expressing our hope that the family had found the peace they deserved. It wasn't much, but it felt right, a way to close the chapter on the story we had unwittingly become a part of. As we packed up our belongings, the cabin seemed different, as if it had been reborn. The eerie feeling that had hung over it was gone, replaced by a quiet tranquility. We locked the door behind us, but this time, it didn't feel like we were leaving something sinister behind. Instead, it felt like we were leaving a place where healing had finally taken place. The ocean waves, once ominous, now sounded soothing, a gentle reminder of the peace that had settled here. Driving away, we looked back one last time at the cabin, nestled against the backdrop of the beach. The memories of what we had experienced would stay with us, but they were no longer tinged with fear. Instead, we felt a sense of connection, not just to each other, but to the family whose story had finally been told. The beach cabin had been a place of secrets, but now it was a place of rest, where the past could finally lay to rest, and we could move forward, changed, but not haunted. It was December 14th, 2021, when I arrived at the beach cabin, hoping for some solitude and a chance to clear my mind. The drive had been long, the weather cold and unforgiving, but the sight of the ocean and the promise of peace made it all worth it. The cabin was as isolated as I had hoped. No neighbors for miles, just the sound of the waves crashing against the shore and the wind howling through the trees. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first night was uneventful, though the cabin had an odd feeling about it, something I couldn't quite place. It was as if the walls held memories, but not the warm, comforting kind. Instead, there was a sense of something unfinished, lingering in the air like a stale scent. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the cold weather and my imagination playing tricks on me. I settled in, made a fire, and tried to relax. As I lay in bed that night, I started to notice the noises. At first, it was just the wind, rattling the windows and creaking the old wooden beams of the cabin. But then, there were other sounds, softer, more deliberate. Footsteps. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. I sat up, straining to hear, but they stopped as soon as I focused on them. My heart raced, the comfort of the cabin now replaced by a growing sense of unease. The next day, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the sounds. I spent the day exploring the beach, trying to enjoy the solitude I had come here for. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me, a constant pressure at the back of my mind. It was as if the cabin was alive, aware of my presence, and not entirely pleased with it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. even though I knew logically that I was. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, more insistent. They moved through the cabin, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was searching for something. I lay frozen in bed, my breath shallow, every nerve on edge. The sound stopped just outside my bedroom door, and for a moment, I thought I could hear breathing, soft, almost a whisper. I wanted to jump up, to throw open the door and confront whatever was out there, but fear kept me paralyzed. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded away, leaving me in a silence that was somehow even more terrifying. The next morning, the unease from the night before still clung to me. The cabin felt different in the daylight, the shadows less menacing, but the memory of those footsteps was impossible to shake. I decided to distract myself by exploring the cabin more thoroughly. Maybe if I could find a logical explanation for the noises, I'd be able to convince myself that everything was fine. As I wandered through the small rooms, I couldn't help but notice how the cabin seemed oddly untouched, as if no one had stayed there in years. The furniture was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the air was thick with a musty odor that suggested abandonment. I found nothing unusual until I reached the back of the cabin, where a narrow door led to what seemed to be a small storage room. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had recently passed through. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small, high window that barely let in the weak winter sun. The air was colder here, almost frigid. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest, its surface worn and scratched. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't resist the urge to open it. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside the chest were objects that seemed out of place in a beach cabin. A dusty old doll with a cracked porcelain face, a stack of faded letters tied with a frayed ribbon, and a small, ornate box. The letters were dated decades ago, written in a flowing, elegant script that spoke of love, loss, and something darker, something unspeakable. The more I read, the more I felt a connection to the writer, a woman who had once lived in the cabin and had experienced something terrifying. As I reached for the ornate box, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, slamming the door shut behind me. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence, something unseen, but undeniably there. The footsteps from the night before echoed in my mind, and I realized, with growing horror, that they hadn't been a figment of my imagination. Whatever had haunted this cabin in the past was still here, and it was growing stronger. I backed away from the chest, my heart racing, but the door wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as the presence grew more oppressive. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, feeding on my fear. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally, but the terror was overwhelming. The letters, the doll, the box, they all seemed to be connected, but I couldn't make sense of it. All I knew was that whatever was in this cabin wasn't going to let me go easily. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening as the unseen presence pressed down on me. My breath came in short gasps, the cold seeping into my bones. I needed to get out, but the door remained stubbornly shut. Panic began to set in as I realized I was truly trapped. In a desperate attempt to calm myself, I turned my attention back to the chest, hoping to find some clue that would explain what was happening. The ornate box in the chest seemed to call to me, its intricate design almost hypnotic. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a small silver locket, tarnished with age. As I held it, a wave of emotions washed over me: sadness, longing, and a deep, overwhelming sense of loss. It was as if the locket was a conduit for the pain that had once filled this place. I could almost hear the voice of the woman who had lived here, her whispers faint and sorrowful. Clutching the locket, I felt a sudden connection to her, a bond that transcended time. I knew now that she was the source of the presence I had felt since arriving at the cabin. Her spirit was trapped here, bound by the sorrow and terror she had endured. The letters hinted at a tragedy, but they were incomplete, the story unfinished. I realized that I needed to find out what had happened to her, to piece together the fragments of her life if I was to have any hope of escaping. I spent the next few hours searching the cabin for more clues, my fear momentarily replaced by a sense of purpose. I found more letters, each one painting a clearer picture of the woman's life. She had come to the cabin to escape something, someone, but the safety she sought had eluded her. The letters spoke of a man, someone she had once loved, but who had become a source of terror. The details were vague, but the fear in her words was unmistakable. As I read the final letter, dated December 18th, 1952, the pieces began to fall into place. She had written about hearing footsteps in the night, about feeling watched, just as I had. The man she feared had found her, and in her last letter, she wrote of locking herself in the very room where I now stood, hoping to escape him. But the letter ended abruptly, the last line smeared as if she had been interrupted. My heart pounded as I realized that whatever had happened to her had left a mark on this place, a mark that was now threatening to consume me as well. The cold intensified, and the presence in the room grew stronger. I could feel her desperation, her fear, and something else, an overwhelming need to finish what she had started. The locket in my hand seemed to pulse with energy, and I knew that I was holding the key to unlocking the mystery of her fate. But with that knowledge came a chilling realization. I wasn't just dealing with her spirit. There was something darker here. The air in the room was thick with tension, the cold seeping deeper into my skin as the presence grew stronger. The locket in my hand felt like it was burning, a heavy reminder that I was holding more than just a piece of jewelry. I was holding a part of her soul, her pain, and her fear. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened to her, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the man she had feared was still here, his presence lingering in the shadows. The realization sent a jolt of terror through me. This wasn't just a haunted cabin. It was a battleground for spirits, a place where her fear had kept her trapped and where his malevolence had rooted itself. I could feel them both now, the woman's desperate need to be free, and the man's dark, oppressive energy, trying to snuff out any light that remained. I knew that if I didn't do something soon, I would be consumed by the same darkness that had claimed her. Driven by a mixture of fear and determination, I tore through the rest of the letters, looking for anything that could help me. Her words spoke of a ritual, something she had planned to do to protect herself, but it was clear she had never completed it. The instructions were vague, written in a trembling hand, but I had no choice. If this was the only way to free her and myself, I had to try. The ritual required me to return to the room where it had all begun, where she had tried to protect herself from the man who had followed her. The very thought of going back there sent shivers down my spine, but I knew there was no other option. I gathered the items mentioned in the letter, a candle, a mirror, and the locket, and headed back to the small, frigid room at the back of the cabin. As I entered the room, the temperature dropped even further, my breath visible in the freezing air. The shadows on the walls seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and contorting into shapes that resembled human figures. His figure, lurking in the darkness. I placed the items on the floor in front of me, arranging them as the letter instructed, and lit the candle. The small flame flickered weakly, barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. I held the locket tightly in one hand and the mirror in the other, following the steps of the ritual as best I could. The air grew thick with an unspoken tension, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The shadows around me grew darker, more defined, as if the man's presence was closing in on me, trying to stop me from completing the ritual. But I pressed on, reciting the words from the letter, my voice trembling, but determined. As I spoke the final words, the locket grew hot in my hand, and the shadows surged forward, their malevolent energy pressing down on me. But then, just as suddenly, they began to recede. The woman's presence, which had been so faint before, grew stronger, her spirit pushing back against the darkness. The candle flame flared up, bright and strong, casting a warm light that drove the shadows back into the corners of the room. The tension in the air snapped, and a sense of peace washed over me. I could feel her gratitude, her relief, as the last of the shadows faded away. The man's presence was gone, his hold on the cabin broken. The locket cooled in my hand, and the room began to warm, the oppressive cold lifting at last. The ritual had worked. She was free. But as I stood there, catching my breath and feeling the warmth return to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The cabin was too quiet, too still, as if it was waiting for something. I glanced at the mirror, expecting to see my own reflection. But what I saw instead sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't my face staring back at me. It was hers. And behind her, just out of focus, was a shadow that hadn't entirely disappeared. The sight of her face in the mirror froze me in place. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of sadness and fear, stared back at me as if trying to convey something urgent. But what terrified me most was the shadow lingering just behind her, barely visible, but undeniably there. The man's presence hadn't been entirely banished. A part of him remained, lurking in the periphery, waiting. I stepped back from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The warmth that had filled the room just moments ago began to fade, replaced by the familiar chill that seeped into my bones. It was as if the ritual had only driven him deeper into the cabin, hiding him in the darkest corners where he could bide his time. The woman's spirit, though freed from his immediate grasp, was still tethered to this place, and now I was too. As I tried to make sense of what I had seen, the cabin seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in, the air thickening with a palpable tension. The shadows crept back, not as forceful as before, but more insidious, blending into the edges of my vision. I could feel his presence, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The thought that I might never escape this place, that I might be trapped here with them, filled me with a cold dread. Desperation took hold of me. I grabbed the locket, clutching it tightly, hoping it would offer some protection, some way out. But as I held it, the warmth that had once radiated from it was gone, replaced by a cold, metallic emptiness. The connection I had felt with the woman was fading, her spirit retreating as the man's presence grew stronger. I realized with a sinking heart that the ritual hadn't freed her. It had only delayed the inevitable. The cabin's door, once shut tight, now creaked open slightly, as if inviting me to leave. But I hesitated, knowing that whatever was out there might be worse than what was inside. The shadows around me began to stir, no longer content to linger in the corners. They edged closer, the oppressive weight of his presence pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The walls seemed to pulse with his malevolence, the very structure of the cabin bending to his will. I had to leave. I knew that staying any longer would mean losing myself to the same darkness that had claimed her. But as I moved toward the door, the shadows surged forward, blocking my path. His presence was everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in the very air I was breathing. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. I felt his cold breath on the back of my neck, heard the faintest whisper in my ear, something unintelligible but filled with malice. In a final, desperate attempt, I hurled the locket into the shadows, hoping to disrupt his hold on me. For a brief moment, the shadows recoiled, and I seized the opportunity. I bolted through the door, out into the cold night air, not daring to look back. The wind howled around me, whipping the sand into a frenzy, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating atmosphere of the cabin. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the cold, wet sand far down the beach. The cabin was just a distant silhouette, barely visible in the darkness. As I caught my breath, I glanced back, expecting to see the shadows creeping out after me, but there was nothing. Just the quiet of the night and the relentless sound of the waves. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I was safe, but as I sat there, the wind carrying the salty tang of the ocean, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, far down the beach, moving slowly toward the water. It was her spirit, free but not at peace, still tethered to this place by the man who had haunted her in life and death. And just behind her, barely visible in the darkness, was another shadow, larger, more menacing. He was still there, still waiting, still watching. I knew then that the cabin would never let me go completely. A part of me would always be connected to that place, to the secrets it held and the spirits that lingered. As I stood up and began the long walk back to my car, the only thing I could do was hope that I had bought myself enough time to escape his grasp. But deep down, I knew that the unseen presence would always be with me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to pull me back into the darkness.